Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I'm grateful for the invitation to address you on this occasion, and I'm going to keep it quite informal and meditative as befits the time of year and the subject matter. It's one of the things that differentiates the believer from the unbeliever, that although we look out in the same landscape of time and space, and we share the same biology, the same neurology, everything else, outwardly we're the same, but we see inwardly meanings where they see only time and space. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created the extraordinary diversity of creation, and He has placed in creation certain, as it were, inward resonances to which the believer is invited to be sensitive. Some places are pleasing to him, others are displeasing. Some places He has told us are holy. Other places have a holiness that might be acquired through generations of righteous actions or righteous prayers. And it's part of the experience of faith that we have a kind of antenna that enables us to feel at ease in places where there is khair and goodness and blessings, and to feel misgivings in a place which is infested, as it were, by dark forces. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has defined this in terms of that which is sacred. Haram is a sanctuary, and there are three great sanctuaries in Islam: Mecca, Medina, Al-Quds. And immediately we recognize that although they're all holy, the degree of holiness, and more subtly the type of holiness, is different. I had the good fortune of spending the last 10 days of Ramadan in Al-Quds, in Al-Aqsa, and you recognize the holiness, the specialness, the apartness of the place, its proximity to heaven, its anticipation of the next world. But it is a different atmosphere that you breathe there to the air that we breathe in the city of the Holy Prophet or in Makkah al-Mukarramah, and it's difficult to define. It's difficult. Similarly, just as in space there are holier places, in time there are holier times. And again, here the unbeliever detects nothing, but just sees or hears the ticking of the clock, whereas we move through life in a state of, as it were, the rising and falling of the waves of the tide of holiness, which is the reality which underpins the outward form of things. So we're told in a hadith, "Inna lillahi fi ayyami dahrikum lanafahat ala fata'arradu laha." Allah has in the days of your time exhalations, so open yourself to them. It does mean exhalations, nafahat. And many of the people in our sapiential or hikmah tradition have a lot to say about what this really means. How does the divine exhale? But it's a very graphic way of explaining that in certain times there is a certain openness that the heart has for dhikrullah and for ibadah and for the service of others. And sometimes we intuit this, but at other times we are told it. So we have a sacred calendar. The days are not equal. And we have in particular the idea of sacred months and sacred times. And we use the same kind of language. So just as Mecca has Al-Masjid al-Haram, we have Al-Ashhur al-Hurum, the holy months, the sacrosanct months, the inviolable months. Just as to commit a sin in a holy place is, as it were, to do something that is in the nature of things magnified, to commit a sin in those times that Allah has declared to be sacred is also something graver than it is at any other time of the year. So we have 4 sacred months: Thalathun Sard wa Shahrun Fard, Dhul Qa'dah, Dhul Hijjah, Muharram, and also Rajab, which is Rajab al-Fard, the single holy month, which comes later in the year, which also has its own rules, its own possibilities, its own opportunities for inward journeying. But the month of Muharram is the one whose name explicitly includes this idea of haram, or being a sanctuary. And it comes at the end of this great series of sacred times, Dhul Qa'dah, when our hearts start to move towards Allah's Masjid Haram, and Dhul Hijjah, when we are either there physically or there with our hearts and participate with the great sacrifice of the Hujjaj and the Eid al-Adha. And then we move on in a very subtle thing, and the problem we human beings with human minds have is that this is to do with the unseen world, with the world of holiness, with things that can't be touched or taught or measured, and it's hard to pin down. You won't find definitions of this really in books of fiqh, anybody's fiqh. It's something that the Wijdan experiences. So what is it for Allah to have designed this holy calendar that's linked to the movements of the moon and the sun and the solar system itself? It's in the nature of the physical world, that leads up to this month that is called Muharram, which literally in Arabic means that which is made holy, that which is made sacrosanct. Well, it's a matter of mystery. We can only speculate. As are all of the important things of religion, we find it difficult to say anything meaningful in human language. But still we intuit it. And we do want, despite this mystery, to know what is the precise atmosphere of this time. Does everybody experience it the same way? Probably not. People experience the Haram of Mecca in different ways, although they all register, if they have any spiritual life in them, it's holiness. Holiness is this very, very subtle thing. It's like beauty. Beauty, when it's really there, is seen and experienced differently by different observers. So what is it that we experience in this particular time? And why is it that the divine wisdom, we might ask, has placed this particular time at the beginning of the year? It feels like the end of the year, because it's coming at the end of those 3 months. It feels like it's the end of something, but it's also the beginning of something, because it's the beginning of the new year. It's a kind of pivotal time. And also, what is the significance of these first 10 days and these nights? And what is the significance of Ashura in particular? And why is this singled out? So we're starting off with a lot of questions. And we've already indicated that probably we're not going to find exact answers, because these are to do with the spirituality of things. We know, however, that in the prophetic tradition, Ashura and the other 10 days are preferential times for fasting. So maybe that gives us a clue. Hadith in Tabarani says, Man sama yoman, whoever fasts a day, min al-ashr al-awail, of the first 10 days, kana lahu bi kulli yawmin thalathuna yawma. For every day he fasts, he will have, as it were, 30 days. So the reward of these fasts is magnified 30-fold. So that immediately signifies real sanctity, just as the prayers in the Masjid al-Haram magnified hundreds of times. So also our fast is magnified. And we know that the Holy Prophet used to fast on the day of Ashura in particular. And towards the end of his life he said, وَلَئِنْ بَقِيتُ إِلَى قَابِلٍ لَأَصُومَنَّ التَّاسُعَ. If I am given to live to the next year, I will fast the 9th as well. And he asked, when he came to Medina, what is the significance of this? And he recognizes this, and the hadith goes on to say, هَذَا يَوْمٌ أَنْقَذَ اللَّهُ فِيهِ مُوسَى. This is the day on which Allah saved Musa. And this immediately opens up a whole range of other traditions, some of them firmly established, others in the realm of popular history or mythology, but all of them pointing towards the same truth, which is that this is a time of beginnings, not just of the calendar, but of something larger, and a time of endings. And that's the nature of dunya. Everything is cyclical. Like the moon is cyclical, the year is cyclical, human beings are born, they flourish, they die, everything comes and goes, everything moves in circles except for the divine, which doesn't move but is absolute being. So we have, for instance, the idea that Adam's expulsion and or his reconciliation happen on Ashura. We have the story that says that Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam was saved finally from the flood on Ashura, and so on with many of the Anbiya. This is something that you'll find in the history of Tabari and Muslim histories. This is the idea the Muslims have had of this being a special time where something comes to an end and something new begins, just like the year itself. It goes round in circles. Even in English we say, when it's New Year, many happy returns. We have this idea that things are going around. Maybe we return again and greet each other next year. So we have already this idea of the specialness, and the hadith which is narrated in Sahih Muslim, Ashura yawmun min ayyamillah. Ashura is one of the days of Allah. Every Muslim recognizes there's something about it, spiritual radiance, radioactivity, power. How we define that, if only we could, if only physicists with all their brilliant equipment could one day produce a meter that could tell us what times and what places are particularly full of barakah, but that meter is the human heart. Science has its limits. Now, if we, as it were, fast forward it and we say this is a day that has been important throughout sacred history in this mysterious way, a time of fasting, and fasting always means repentance, renunciation, moving away from dunya, recognizing the fleeting nature of things, our absolute weakness and dependence on the world, and the need for sabr. And we move it to the story of Islam. We find another register of this, which is that the divine wisdom determined that in the history of the Ummah, some of the most traumatic and heart-wounding events in our history happen at this time. And again, we would really like to know why at this particular time, why Ashura, why this time of Tawbah, why this time when prophets were released. But this is probably beyond us, but we know that there's a deep wisdom there that is going to enrich us and help us to be healed. And we know also that this is something to do with Tawbah, not just somebody's Tawbah maybe long ago, but the Tawbah that we need ourselves. Sacred history is there not just to inform us about stuff that happened in the distant past, but to explain that things move in circles, and therefore Ashura always comes again. And the recollection of past tragedies is always something that's only useful to do if it helps us to move on, and to move on in our own personal journey of sacrifice and tawbah. And this is the way in which the Ummah has always received this. Now, it is not the nature of Islam to be suspicious about the divine purpose. Ours is an upbeat, optimistic religion. Sayyidina Adam and Hawa, alayhim as-salam, were expelled, and then how quickly Allah gave them the words, and they were forgiven. This is the divine nature. He is Rahman. It is not our nature to see only the shadows in the world. It is our nature to be hurt by them and to wish they were not there. We also know as believers that the shadows are part of how things have to be. We often ask, why do I have toothache? Why is my doll broken? Why did my car crash? Why did my daughter not survive her chemotherapy? Whatever it is, we all have that question, and it's natural to ask that. The Holy Prophet ﷺ was a person who was so frequently afflicted. And the wisdom of faith says we, as human beings, feel pain, and we are designed to feel pain, spiritual as well as physical pain. It's part of the thorny path that we tread in this world, but we know that that's an inevitable consequence of the existence of the world itself. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He is Nuru samawati wal ard, the light of the heavens and the earth. And again, the mind struggles to work that out. Well, does it mean light as physicists would understand it, which has a speed and photons? Well, evidently not. But still, the metaphor, the mathal, is going to give our hearts some kind of pointer. The light of the heavens and the earth In other words, the emanation, the faid, the outflowing of the divine being, which is the only true being, is something that is here as well as there, that is here as well as up there, and that al-wujud al-haq lillah, true being is God's being. That again boggles the mind. But where there is the outflowing, there is differentiation. And the differentiation is expressed in the language of the Qur'an in terms of az-zulumat wa nur. So Allah says, Allahu waliyul ladina amanu yukhrijuhum min az-zulumati ila nur. Allah is the protecting friend, alhamdulillah, we have no other protecting friend, of those who have Iman, takes them out of the shadows into the light. The world is, in a sense you could say the world, as we normally see it, is shadows. And that's what we see. And the light is something that makes the shadows possible. And the light is Allah, Nuru Samawati wal Ard. We just see the shadows. As soon as there is the one and the many, as well as wahdat, there is kathrat, there have to be the shadows so that the light can be differentiated. And the shadows entail darkness, absence of light, and what we human beings experience as pain, separation, grief, nostalgia, lamentation. It's part of the fabric of the created world that as soon as there is distance from the divine perfection, there is what we experience as imperfection. That's what it is to exist in the world of manifestation. So we know this, and we accept this, and it is also the case that the great ones experience it and see it with particular clarity, precisely because they are so close to the light. In the case of the Blessed Founder himself, we find that he is, in many of our traditions, the first entity to be created. And we speak of a Nur al-Muhammadi, the light of Muhammad. And in many of our metaphysical systems, across the denominational spectrum of Islam, we find this idea of the first manifestation in the world of the non-divine to be the prophetic principle. And then other layers of manifestation. So he is light, Siraj Munir. But at the same time, he really experiences the shadows, because having been to the light on the night of the Mi'raj, the point that even the greatest angel couldn't reach, into the light, he comes back into that shadowy place called pagan Makkah and deals with the realities of the world out of his rahmah. So because he is rahmatul lil alameen, he does not remain with the light, even though that's his natural home, but he comes to help us and to sort us out, because his people needed the light. And so he experiences the pains of this world. And he experiences the shadows, he sees them, and he weeps when his sons die, and he weeps when he sees his companions suffering. He weeps when he sees the ignorance of his own people. And this is why we have this challenging hadith which says, أَشَدُّ النَّاسِ بَلَاءً الْأَنْبِيَاء ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ. Those who are tried the most grievously are the prophets, and then those who succeed them, those who are nearest to them. And the mind boggles and says, if these people are so beloved to Allah, if Allah truly loves a human being, whether it be the founder, whether it be his grandson, or whoever it might be, or my sainted mother-in-law who never misses a prayer, why do they get sick? Why do they suffer? Why this tribulation? This is again one of the mysteries of dunya, but it is in a sense part of the nature of wilaya, that in the process of coming from the darkness into the light, the completeness of the journey is measured by the fact that they truly experience and witness the suffering that exists in this dunya. And this is a deep mystery. The problem of suffering, the problem of evil are deep paradoxes. We'll say a few things about Mullah Kashifi. Husain Vaiz Kashifi, perhaps one of the greatest scholars of this ummah who have reflected on this dark mystery of suffering and why the innocent lamb is unjustly slain, and who have found in that contemplation something that helps them to break their pride, something that helps them to remember the inevitability of death, something that helps them to pay less attention to the next shopping trip and what they can do with their credit card and all the other dunya stuff that the ego craves, to remember the reality that this is a world that's made up of shadows as well as light, and a world that moves in cycles, and that our greatest certainty really in the world, whatever our religion might be, is that our cycle will turn and one day we will return to the earth. There is a certain breaking of our pride and our unrealistic aspirations in recalling the fact of suffering. But this recollection is always done in due balance. And this is because of what we refer to as the optimism of Islam. When the Holy Prophet's own son Ibrahim died, he wept. What a calamity. Calamity for him, for his family, for his people. And his tears fell. But he said, وَلَا نَقُولُ مَا يُسْخِطُ الرَّبِّ. We will not say something that will anger the Lord. وَإِنَّا عَلَى فِرَاقِكَ يَا إِبْرَاهِيمُ لَمَحْزُونُونَ. And we are sorrowful, O Ibrahim, at the parting from you. This is the perfect prophetic adab. He wept as a human being, fully human being who wept. He was part of that world of light and also shadows and experienced the pain. Experienced it more than we could imagine. And yet, he does not say anything that angers the Lord. That was the way of the Jahiliyyah. Instead, a certain resignation. The meaning of the word Islam itself. لَنْ يُصِيبَنَا إِلَّا مَا كَتَبَ اللَّهُ لَنَا. Nothing will afflict us except that which Allah has prescribed for us. And in our literature we have this almost tension, because in human nature there's almost a tension between, on the one hand, the divine decree, which the pen has written, in the Lawh Mahfuz, and it's the divine wisdom, which we often don't understand. Even if it hurts, we accept al-qadar, khayrihi wa sharri, hulwihi wa murri, sweet and sour, we accept Allah's decree. But at the same time, often we speak about the spheres, and we speak about fate, and other ways that human language uses in order, as it were, not to blame the divine. So we find this quite a lot in our literature. We talk about charkhi falak in Persian, Turkish, Urdu, a lot of languages, the wheel of fate, which is simply the poet's mu'addab, or well-mannered way of referring to the divine decree and allowing the poet to produce what sounds like a complaint, while not compromising the poet's muwahhid awareness that everything is the divine decree, and that those who are innocently slain are in paradise. وَلَا تَحْسَبَنَّ الَّذِينَ قُتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ أَمْوَاتًا بَلْ أَحْيَاءٌ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ يُرْزَقُونَ. Divine commandment. Do not think that those who are killed in Allah's path are dead. Rather, they are alive in the presence of their Lord, receiving provision. That's good news. So on the one hand, the prophetic way to weep, to recognize that there is tragedy in the world, as part of our full humanity. On the other hand, to be balanced and, in a sense, to be grateful to the divine for receiving pure souls into his mercy. And this is what makes life bearable, the hope and the optimism about the one who has called himself Ar-Rahman before he has called himself anything else. So I said I wanted to read something from Mullah Kashifi, who has this really amazing book, Rawza al-Shuhada, which generally the Ummah has recognized as its greatest recital of this particular, the spiritual significance of recognizing the shadows that exist in the world in a balanced way. And it culminates with the suffering of Imam Husayn, of Karbala, of the sufferings of the Ahl al-Bayt. And for this reason, it's a neglected, at least to those of us in the West who are a bit divorced from this tradition, a neglected classic that actually shows how these things unite us. He was from Afghanistan, but the book is really popular in Iran. The Rawza Khani is a popular Iranian thing to this day, the first 10 days of Muharram, because it's divided into 10 chapters, so that one chapter is read on each of the 10 days. But also really popular amongst the scholars of India of all denominations. Really popular in the Ottoman Empire, which was, of course, a Sunni state, so that one of Turkey's best-known poets, Fuzuli, translates the whole thing into Turkish. Hadiqat al-Su'ada, the garden of the blessed, and it becomes one of the great classics of the Turkish language, and all of the sultans have copies beautifully written for them, and it's something that reminds us that this actually unites us, just as the experience of suffering unites humanity. So also, this time of Muharram, when we have the end of the old, the beginning of the new beginnings, but the reminder of death, suffering, misfortune, the Charkhi Falak, this is something that unites the Ummah. So I used to live in Istanbul, and in Muharram they have all kinds of very special things that they do that are from this tradition. And one of them is that they recite from the minarets of the Great Mosque of Istanbul for the first 10 days of Muharram certain marsiya, which is a kind of lamentation or an ode or an expression of gratitude for the life of Imam Husayn. Very beautifully done. I used to live near the Fatih Mosque in Istanbul and would hear this regularly above the traffic and the honking and the ambulances. You could hear this soaring voice. It's still a living tradition. Similarly, every year in Turkey, the tradition is for the Prime Minister or the President, Erdogan now performs this office, to go to the Mosque of Sunbul Sinan, which is in the Koca Mustafa Pasha district of Istanbul, where they have had for hundreds of years, on Ashura in particular, a very beautiful dhikr from Zuhr until Asr, I don't know why, but early afternoon, where they have the Marsiya and the Maqtal and as written by the great Ottoman poets of the past. If you're in Istanbul at the time, it's a very beautiful thing and has a very distinctive Turkish thing. And the last time Erdogan went, he said, Karbala is an event that unites all Muslims because it's the calamity of the death, the martyrdom of the Holy Prophet's grandson is something that brings tears to the eyes of everybody. So Mullah Kashifi's book is a reminder of how these things should be points of convergence in an age when many of the enemies of Islam want to pull us apart. These texts remind us that the deep logic of things actually should be understood as pulling us together. So let me just read a few things, because there's always a particular blessing that comes from hearing the words of souls greater than our own, souls from the past, from great ages of faith. This is really a pathetic tiny little drop from the Rawza al-Shuhada, which is in hundreds of pages in the original Farsi. And this contains poets from other traditions as well, so it's a very loose relation to the original. But here is a reflection that indicates where Mullah Husain Kashifi wants to start. So just to run through the 10 chapters so that you get a sense of what happens in this tradition on each night of Muharram, of the first 10 days. Chapter 1, the tribulations of the prophets. Chapter 2, Quraysh persecute the Master of Goodness, the Holy Prophet. Chapter 3, the death of the Master of the Messengers. Chapter 4 is about Fatima az-Zahra. Chapter 5, aspects of the life of Imam Ali. Chapter 6, virtues of Imam Hassan. Chapter 7, virtues of Imam Husayn. Chapter 8, the martyrdom of Muslim bin Aqil. Many of you all know that story. Chapter 9, Imam Husayn arrives at Karbala and fights the enemy. So that's kind of the climax of the whole recitation. And it's an amazingly beautiful, lyrical, powerful Farsi. It's really one of the classics of the language. Chapter 10, events after Karbala. And then there's a finale and a lot of prayers at the end. So that's the basic structure of it. You can see that the logic, the drama of it leads up to the battle itself. But the way he starts is by talking about the calamities of experienced by the Anbiya. And what I've done here is to take a translation of a Turkish text. Ziya Pasha lived about 200 years ago and was a well-known Turkish poet who was famous for his love of the Ahl al-Bayt and his narratives, marsiyas about Imam Husayn. I don't think he wrote a maqtal. Generally the maqtal literature is rather earlier in Turkish history. But this is a translation of the way he begins this. The father of mankind was cast from Eden's happy plain. As place of trial for Abraham, his offspring's neck was ta'en. The grief of separation from his son was Jacob's bane. The saintly Yusuf's biding place was e'en the jail and chain. Ailments and aches of frame and limb Ayub made groan in woeful vein. And Zachariah to the sore must needs his head constrain. The prophet Yahya was beheaded by fell tyranny. Isa the fatherless endured full much of grief and pain. At Ta'if were the prophet's legs to ruby turned, and then yon lustrous pearls were on the day of Uhud broke atwain. For hunger's pangs he bound the stone fast to his blessed waist amain. Full little recked the Lord of humankind of worldly gain. The blessed Haidar sank at last beneath the blade profane, and Hassan poisoned passed away to paradise, the pure domain. And foully murdered was the monarch of the martyr train. In whomsoe'er the love of the divine doth all ordain, to him in that same fashion anguish and woe they still pertain. To him in that same fashion woe and anguish still pertain. So you get the sense of the mood music. He's sobering us up, reminding us that even the ones who are most beloved to heaven underwent these tribulations. So let none of us think that we necessarily are going to have an easy time in life. And very often, so many times down the centuries, Muslims have found a certain ease in realizing that however great their own afflictions, the great ones, the beloved ones of the past, suffered even more. We can hardly imagine the tribulations of the holy prophets and the great awliya of this ummah. So there is a kind of bittersweet dimension to this. On the one hand, it's grim. On the other hand, let us be grateful for what we have and remember that all those individuals are in paradise where the finite pains and pangs of this dunya are washed away by Al-Kawthar and no bitter memories can remain. So I'd like to do the chapter on Hazrat Fatima Zahra is a particularly beautiful one, and if any of you know Farsi, I would recommend that maybe you even start with that one. It's one of the most beautiful, almost portraits of her that exists in our whole literature, I think. So let's do one or two more of these before I close. We haven't got that much time. Yeah, let's just move on then to the ninth chapter, which is the catastrophe of Karbala itself. Now, in our literature, we didn't really have something that was like novel writing. Instead, we have these long, often poetic sagas, recitals whose experience would be rather like your own Maqtal tradition, a public recitation at an opportunity for tawbah and reflection and meditation. And these would be, therefore, designed to be heard by an audience. You wouldn't curl up in the corner with Fuzuli's Hadiqat al-Su'ada and just read it on your own. Islamic poetry, this literature, was always designed to be something for a group reflection. Therefore you don't get the kind of novelist's complex setting of the stage, and the weather was like this, and it was incredibly... You get some formulaic invocations of what it was like, but much is left to the individual imagination. But still, there's a lot which is extremely vivid. So here's one qasida done into a sort of English. Oh, hear my tale, my noble thane. Let me amain your time detain. Help me unwind my tangled skein with the sword and the sand and the angels twain. He stood on Karbala the plain, the master of the martyr train, the knight of light, the bold Husayn, with the sword and the sand and the angels twain. Since age of Abel and of Cain, the strife of godly and profane, the war to whelm the devil's reign, with the sword and the sand and the angels twain. The foeman feigns his deep disdain. He fears what heaven might ordain, for falsehood's fortunes ever wane, with the sword and the sand and the angels twain. Our noble hero fears no chain, no desert heat and cruel terrain. Of heaven's foes he is the bane, with the sword and the sand and the angels twain. Afore the host stood Al-Husayn, the arrows falling round like rain. His loved ones died with bloody stain, with the sword and the sand and the angels twain. So bitterly did fate ordain his noblest folk for to be slain. Those of the cloak let none disdain, with the sword and the sand and the angels twain. With russet wine in every vein, their banners lastly shall attain the victory and right retain, with the sword and the sand and the angels twain. With righteousness from sin abstain, you stand on Karbala the plain, each faithful heart may heaven gain, with the sword and the sand and the angels twain. So it is quite effective, even in this very dim translation. We are, as it were, transported to those terrible 3 days. Karbala is at the end of the third day, and the path to the river has been blocked, and the thirst is as bad as the fighting. And then on the third day, the single combat, the famous 32 cavalry, the 40 infantry, the great hosts surrounding them, and the final onslaught and the horrific end as the sun sets on the third day. And Kashifi depicts this. But even at a great distance, we get a sense of that. Let me just give you one more from this translation. This is very much in the Marsiya, the lamentation genre. Upon the field of misfortune, all my people lie, their ruddy wounds all untended, open to the sky. The devil's blade has been fashioned in the blaze of hate, its poisoned spirit impassioned in its fiery fate. The edge knows thirst that is rabid, questing here its point, to holy flesh for its scabbard, blood it shall anoint. The rainless airs of the valley hear my lonely cry, the widowed daughters of Ali teach the dust to sigh. Behold Abbas, hero regal, hear Sakina's thirst, father of grace of the eagle, place that maiden first. To see the blood of my brothers dye the sorry sands, to hear the keening of mothers, cheeks clenched in their hands. So teach the ways of fair patience to the weak and wronged, strengthen with hope and forbearance wretchedness prolonged. So you can imagine the dramatic impact of this in much better Farsi. And 10 successive days, say in Lucknow or Saharanpur, or a great centre where of India, where people really savor the power of the Persian language and are really transported back to empathize and to stand along with the victims of Karbala. And the end of it all is, of course, the turning of a new page and hope. Just as the Shuhada have been translated to the mercy of their Lord and to the gardens where all suffering is washed away. So also, we should feel that every affliction that overshadows us in our lives, the sickness, the death of friends, the suffering of people in many parts of the world, the shadows that exist in this complex dunya, that they are ultimately only shadows. Allah speaks of the shadows and the light. Light in the Quran is always one. Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. The shadows always plural, because shadows are the world of multiplicity, the world of the many, where we inhabit. We inhabit many things, and our job is to infer from the many the necessary existence of the one. But what is the relationship between the reality of the shadow and the reality of light? There's no equality, none at all. The shadow is completely dependent on the light for its being. If there were no light, how long would the shadow survive? It's purely contingent. It has to be there as part of the manifestation in dunya, and we're in that dunya with our massive ignorance, and we suffer and we hurt, and others suffer and hurt, but it's all part of what will pass away. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, يَبْقَى وَجْهُ رَبِّكَ ذُو الْجَلَالِ وَالْإِكْرَامِ. The face of your Lord remains full of majesty and generosity. And at the end of the journey, of each and every person who has realized that there can't be shadows without there being a light, it's the basic wisdom of the believer. The basic wisdom leads us ultimately, albeit a journey that in the next world may be an extended one, to the divine throne and to the light of lights, Nur al-Anwar, and the great blessing of the ru'ya, the vision of the face of the Lord subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's the end of the road for those who in this world go through this vale of tears. So this, seems to me, is what we inhale at this bittersweet and, for many of us, difficult time of the year, when we reflect on some of the most hideous injustices which have afflicted the prophetic house and the history of this ummah, the shedding of such holy blood, the one whom the Holy Prophet ﷺ said, "Ana min al-Husayn, wal Husaynu minni," is, as it were, an aspect of the Holy Prophet, the shedding of his blood, no little enormity. We reflect on that hideous catastrophe and the manner in which it took place, and we just remember that as well as the shadows there is the light, and that for the awliya, la khawfun alayhim wa la hum yahzanun, they have no fear, neither shall they grieve. And this consoles us in our suffering and helps us to move on. So it seems to me that this is a good message for us, not just at this time of year, but generally at this juncture in the history of the Ummah, where there seem to be such strong shadows, and where there seems to be so much darkness in so many hearts, so many perverse misinterpretations, so many exaggerations of differences, so much emphasis on self-righteousness, and so much forgetfulness of the divine name Ar-Rahman. Time of darkness, to be sure. That in this story we find a kind of healing and a recollection of the fact that the great ones pass on to the mercy of their Lord, and there is always a cycle. that after this particular tunnel, inshallah, there will be light again, and that everything ultimately is in the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And our ummah has a law and a theology which has been, in the divine wisdom, designed for the end times. So the Holy Founder says, Ana Nabiyul Malhama. I am the prophet of the tribulations that will happen at the end of the world. He doesn't live into them, so what is he saying? He's saying his way, his theology, his vision, his style of life, his law, is the one that will most help human beings in the ship that is the faith to sail safely through these really stormy, mad tempests, whether it be genetic manipulation or environmental destruction or sectarian madness, or whatever it is that is going wrong with humanity, and will help us to remain sane. And the basic message of that is La ilaha illallah, Tawheed. Everything is under control. It's in God's hands. And when we are grieved, we do so in due proportion, recognizing that it's just part of our humanity to experience suffering. And the Holy Prophet wept. But what is important is the cyclical movement and the awareness that Allah is ala kulli shay'in qadir, is powerful over all things. And when we lose sight of that, then we go mad very quickly, either as mad atheists or gamblers or suicide bombers or fundamentalists, because unless you retain that deep wisdom that there is tragedy in the world and we may suffer it, but our hope is always in Allah, unless you maintain that, the modern world is actually a very difficult place psychically to inhabit. There's so many pressures and so much information about the stuff that is going wrong, but it's actually hard to carry that. But part of the message of this time of the year and of this holy month is that by contemplating the shadows and by looking at one of the ugliest of them all in the eye, we keep things in due proportion and we remember Allah's mercy as they remembered Allah's mercy and that they've gone on to Allah's mercy. And this is important because unless we have the principle of Tawheed and recognize that everything in history is in Allah's decree, then it will be increasingly hard for us to sustain the psychic burdens that the craziness of the modern world is placing on our shoulders. We have to remember, لَن يُصِيبَنَا إِلَّا مَا كَتَبَ اللَّهُ لَنَا. Nothing will afflict us except that which Allah has written for us. And once we have that wisdom, even if we don't understand the reasons why it is wise, we will remain, inshallah, mu'mineen. So this is just my brief summary of why I think this is an important time of year for us to reflect, not just in meaningless sorrow for something that happened a long time ago, but something that is alive today. As the poet says, we're all on Karbala. We all have our particular afflictions. We're all the victims of injustice, misunderstandings, and the world is an abrasive place, a desert in Iraq full of thorns and heat, and life is not easy, but we need to remember the divine decree, and that's why the principle of the divine power and the divine ordination of things is so strongly emphasized in our revelation, because that helps us to keep sane in a time of real tribulation and difficulty. Anyway, I think I have run out of time, and I crave your indulgence for having spoken perhaps a little bit too long, but this is a deep and a subtle subject, and one where balance is really important. And I have to run for my train back to Cambridge at some point, but if the organisers wish, I'm happy to try and answer a few questions if there are any.
Salawat. Oh, we do have time for questions. First question.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Thank you kindly. My question is, I suppose, a rather simple one. It's to do with at the end of your talk, you mentioned the inculcation of this divine wisdom. that we need told. And we sort of live in this treacherous, postmodern, materialistic, decadent capitalist world with a 24-hour news cycle of doom that's sort of tearing apart the Ummah. Now, do you have any suggestions as to how you inculcate this wisdom, say in younger people, children, the youth, who are facing a world that seems to be full of senseless calamity? You know, remembrance. You know, it's so easy to forget what it is that makes us human. For example, is there anything one can do to instill that in people?
Yeah, essentially what people need is zikr, to remember Allah, and the fact that, as one of my teachers put it, an infinitesimal distance behind the surface of things there is the divine beauty and truth and power and light, and at the deepest level everything is under control, even if on the surface there seem to be storms. So that Yakeen, the being of things, is essentially what aspect of the divine nature and the divine names is really essential, and that's something that you can't just intellectualize about, but has to be experienced through spending a lot of time contemplating the beauty of nature, which the Quran endlessly urges us to do, and a lot of Muslims forget to do. We are asked to look at Allah's signs because it enhances Eman in a very subtle and direct way, and also to make dhikr, and mutlaq al-dhikr, whether it be praying, reading Quran, any salawat people might have, all khair, if it reminds them of reality. So we need to give our children in particular a lot of connection to nature, because their souls are naturally, young people are naturally believers, and they're smart enough to see that all of this can't just come out of some void, but the most obvious explanation is that it has a designing, ordering force behind it, and to give them that very strong yaqeen, not just by telling them bedtime stories, but by showing them the realities of the physical world, and by giving them a lot of dhikr, and exposing them to beauty all the time, as much as possible. Let's show them beautiful things and keep them away from ugliness. Ideally, don't have a TV in the house, don't allow the kind of crazy, because unfortunately, the mass media, the entertainment industry nowadays is basically, well, almost is entirely driven by the desire for money. And what attracts people is in our perverse age, ugliness and cruelty and obscenity, and not really beauty and harmony, because beauty and harmony involves stillness and reflection and contemplation, whereas ugliness is often something that's hurried, that's vicious, that's cool, that's snappy, that can fit into a tweet. That's the nature of wickedness. The shaitan moves very quickly and shifts, whereas serenity and what the heart craves is stillness, and that takes time. And there's even evidence that the human brain is being reconfigured by the fact that young people are endlessly distracted by message after message after message, and even the capacity of the mind for religious conceptualization and dhikr may be being impaired, because we're not designed for this. We're designed for what human beings have always lived as, which is hunter-gatherers on the African plains or something. For 99% of our history, that's how we've been. We weren't tweeting, but actually things were kind of quiet and reflective and probably boring most of the time. And that's what is natural to us, and that's when we feel at ease. When we're constantly doing stuff, we're more likely to malfunction, to get stressed, to get depressed, to have all kinds of strange dieting disorders or whatever it is that happens to the young people nowadays. So this endless distraction, which is how people make money out of us, the latest message, is really destructive. We need to keep young people away from that for as long as possible. Not easy. Not easy.
Any questions from the lady side?
Okay, thank you very much for the talk. How do you relate the message of Imam Husayn to the time being that we are at the moment? How do we get that message to get united and then save Islam, as he went to become a martyr to save Islam? It seems for me, the Muslim, whether they're Shia or Sunni, they don't follow what he's done years and years ago. What's your response or your suggestion on that?
Well, I mean, partly it's what I've been saying, which is that what unites us is the experience of humanity, the experience of suffering. We're all, we've all tasted some small drop from the cup of martyrdom ourselves, and that's why the story immediately speaks to us. I think we need to recall, as Erdogan says he is trying to do, the fact that these events and those times actually should be read as uniting us rather than dividing us. There's so many people in the world who are terrified of Islam, terrified of its demography and its power and its growing strength in the West, and they really want to divide and rule and tear us apart. And the message of the great ones and the great imams throughout Islamic history has been that this ummah should be one ummah, and this is something sacred. The Holy Prophet says, if you see somebody damaging the unity of the ummah of Muhammad, then fight him, whoever he might happen to be. Unity is really important. And the trauma of those early times is that people felt that the garment of Islam was starting to be torn. And we need to be very wary of that. There's a well-known article by an Israeli writer that was published, it's on the internet about 30 years ago, which says that the only way Israel is eventually going to survive in the long term is if we can get the Sunnis and the Shia to fight each other. And that's something that we really needs to sober us up. But if we return to these initial moments and actually look at them, we find that there's always areas that the scholars will argue about, and that's what they're there for. But the basic message of it, suffering, tawheed, sacrifice, nobility, justice, injustice, the prophetic family, are things that should unite us. And we need to get into the mindset that says, let's look for what unites us, rather than do what the shaitan and our enemies and the ego wants to do, which is to find faults in other people, which is, that's the demonic tendency within us. If instinctively we're always looking for faults in people when we meet them, then we'll never get that unity.
Thank you. Next question. Yep.
Given that the events of Karbala happened very early in Islam, given that the events of Karbala happened so early in Islamic history, in the early time of the Caliphate, what lessons does it can we learn about the relationship between Islam and political power and the potential corruptions that brings?
Well, I suppose it's one of those timeless stories full of archetypes. The idea of the misuse of power versus a righteous but apparently hopeless sacrifice. There's a lot of timeless archetypes there which I think speak to us, and you can probably find not just in this story but in many of the Quranic sort of face-off stories between Musa and Fir'aun, for instance, or the Holy Prophet and Abu Jahl, this idea that there's always this contestation between the rich and the privileged in their palaces and the poor and the righteous who are acting on behalf of the poor and the righteous. This is one of the constants of history. And it's certainly the case today, because we have this massive disparity between rich and poor now in the world, growing all the time. I was recently in Russia, where about 20% of the country's wealth is owned by about 100 people. So you see grandmothers begging on the streets, and then you have these oligarchs with their obscenely huge mansions. That's exactly what this story is about. It's about religion being on the side of the poor, the downtrodden, the mustada'afin, the oppressed. How you interpret that in terms of the current political reality is something that Muslims aren't united on. But the basic principle of moral outrage in the face of Pharaonic hard-heartedness is something that's timeless.
Any questions from the ladies' side? Otherwise, brother there. Sorry.
Thank you for your talk. It was really refreshing. I just wanted to ask where you draw the line between accepting something as God's will and being active in doing something about the injustices that you see. Yep. The acceptance of everything being the will of Allah, does that not risk forcing you into a kind of submission and passiveness? And also the second aspect to my question was with regards to, for example, watching the news daily and being aware of everything that's going on. Do you not think that that's also essential for us? It's essential for us to know what's going on so that we do something about it, and kind of not knowing and just going into nature and observing that.
I mean, these are both good questions. The first is about does our awareness that, as the hadith says, the pens are dried and the pens are lifted and the books are dried, mean that we should just sit around and be fatalist? That's not the prophetic way. And the genius of the Holy Prophet is that he knows absolutely that his Lord is powerful over all things, and that's the message he's pushing against his people who think there's lots of gods who have kind of partial knowledge. It's essential to his worldview. But along with that Yakeen, he's also one of history's great activists. If you look at what he achieved, uniting Arabia, which nobody had ever done before, bringing peace between the warring tribes, ending the feuds, bringing them from polytheism to monotheism, bringing a law when they hadn't had a law before. That's a unique achievement in history. Nobody's ever managed to do such things in 23 years. So getting that balance right, on the one hand, knowing that Allah is powerful over all things, but following his commandment, paradoxically, to be an activist and to hold those things in balance is the essence of what the believer does. So you're active because your empirical experience of the world is that there is cause and effect. But intellectually, your yaqeen is that that's on the surface and that the reality of the thing is the divine unity and the divine knowledge, which helps you to remain sane when things go wrong. It's very important. The other thing is, should we be watching the news all the time? Usually what you see on the news is things that you can't do anything about. If a ship capsizes in the Mediterranean and some Somalis die, I can't do anything about that. Now, it might motivate me to give more in charity, but hopefully I'm doing that already. So why should I get that kind of experience of suffering and pain and distraction constantly fed to me by the mass media, this endless horror story? It's not good for the spirit. It's very unnatural. In past ages, people would hear the Mongols have sacked Baghdad, but the news would get to them 6 months later, and then there'd be something else. Now it's in HD every evening, and it is very damaging to the soul. So, and usually, when there is a headline, the actual meaning of it is only clear weeks or months later. So, the Iraq invasion, everybody's panicking. They think Saddam Hussein, weapons of mass destruction. There's all of that chatter. Now we all know that that was nonsense. And most big events in the world can't be interpreted as they happen, but can only be understood later on. So the headlines don't really tell us much. To read analytical pieces by serious academics and journalists about larger patterns is always useful, but to constantly follow the headlines, it'll do your head in after a while. It's very spiritually damaging, and it's not useful.
Okay, final question, because we are running out of time, and I know there are lots of people who've asked questions, so but we'll have to end.
Thank you so much for your very nice speech, and I very much like the concept of, or the emphasis on the fact that Ashura or Karbala can unify the whole Muslim Ummah. In fact, it's potentially unifying the whole mankind, and this is the one of the interpretations of what Prophet Muhammad ﷺ has said. Al-Husayn Misbah al-Huda, Inna al-Husayna Misbah al-Huda. He is the torch for truth seekers. He did not specify what a group of people who can benefit from that. However, there is a little comment, if I may. It's about the issue of Ashura being a day of glory, day of Allah. It is a very controversial issue, because most of the scholars in the Ahlul Bayt school of thought believe that these stories about Adam, Noah, and Musa have been fabricated and made by the Bani Umayyah to justify their wrongdoings and to encourage people undermine the crime, if you like, and get them celebrating their triumph. Because the implication of Adam receiving words from Allah, Noah alayhi salam, and Musa, it's all about the triumph. It's all about, you know, their, if you like, mission prevailed. So it implies that Banu Umayyah have prevailed, if you like. So that's why even the fasting of Ashura is not encouraged in the school of Ahlul Bayt. Just to make this comment here.
Okay, yeah, that's a comment rather than a question, I think. So thank you for that.
I think, thank you very much. Salawat.